Pritili, your host for this session, and I sincerely thank you for joining us. On behalf of Modak Academy, it is my immense pleasure to welcome each one of you to today's international webinar. Today's topic, from reading to research, transforming curiosity into scholarly inquiry. Reading is the gateway to knowledge, but research is the journey that transforms curiosity into discovery. In today's dynamic academic world, the ability to think critically, ask meaningful questions, and contribute original ideas is more valuable than ever. This webinar is designed to inspire students, educators, researchers, and lifelong learners to bridge the gap between reading and scholarly research. It is now my great privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Ananya Dasghosh. Dr. Dasghosh is an accomplished academic, researcher, and educator currently serving as Assistant Professor in the Department of English at CGC University, Mohali. She is also a researcher, a peer reviewer for Routledge Journals, and the Secretary of the Board of Studies at CGC University. She has submitted her PhD in English Literature at City University, Ludhiana, and holds a master's degree in English from Ravindra Bharati University, a Bachelor in Education, a Bachelor of Arts Honours in English from the University of Calcutta. With more than a decade of teaching experience, Dr. Dasghosh has made remarkable contribution to English language and literature educations. She has mentored students in research writing, literary criticism, and critical thinking, while also serving as an English language assessor, subject matter expert, and academic content developer. Her work as a peer reviewer reflects her commitment to maintaining the highest standard of academic excellence. Her areas of expertise include literary criticism, research methodology, eco-criticism, environmental humanities, gender and trauma studies, post-colonial literature, and academic writing. She has published numerous research papers in Corpus Indexed and UGC Carolison journals and has presented her scholarly work at several prestigious national and international conferences. Dr. Dasghosh has also received several distinguished honors, including the National Poetry Award 2026, the Emily Dickinson Poetry Award 2023, and the Best Research Paper Award at IMA-RC 2023. In addition to her academic achievement, she is a published poet and author reflecting her passion for both research and creative expression. With that and without any further delay, I have the honor of inviting Dr. Ananya Dasghosh to begin today's lecture. Please proceed, ma'am.
First of all, a very good evening to everyone present here. And thank you so much, Ms. Pritili, for this absolute honor to introduce me. And I'm really flabbergasted, actually. So thank you so much for this wonderful introduction and for giving me this opportunity to interact with students and from of various research scholars as well. So I'm sure that it would be meaningful and it will contribute to Modak Trainer Academy as well. So I'll start with my presentation. Just allow me one moment to present my screen with all of you. In the meanwhile, I'll just ask if I'm visible and audible clearly to everyone or not.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thank you so much for the confirmation. I hope the PowerPoint is visible to everyone.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So since our host, Ms. Pritili, has already given us a vivid idea about what the lecture talk is going to be about, but more than a lecture talk, I think so. This session would be more of an interaction, discussion, a scholarly gathering to understand how to move from reading to research, actually. So before I delve into this particular talk, I have a small question for every one of you present here, because I think so it is very pertinent and important for us to understand this, because I have often thought about this myself when I was starting my PhD journey, or I have even seen many scholars asking me this question as well, that how do we move from reading literature to actually producing the research? Now, if we think carefully, that the answer lies in itself, right? Each one of us read lots of novels. We enjoy reading poetry. Probably if I consider some of very eminent novels like Khalid Hosseini's The Kite Runner, or probably if we talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved, there are lots of nuances, there are lots of small intricacies that helps us to wonder that, like, why are we thinking about that novel, right? So why are we talking about that particular scene that has created a mark in our hearts, right? Because many a times when we read literature, when we see literature, even when we watch movies, we see that we are extremely moved with that, right? So today's talk or today's session will actually therefore simplify how reading and research are co-connected, and how do we develop the researcher's way of seeing actually. So, when you hear the word research, what is the first word that comes to your mind? I mean, if each one of you can write something in the chat box, that would be very helpful as well, because I think so. That will help us to understand that how research is driven not as a monologue conversation, but it's a kind of a dialogue, right? So that is what we are going to talk about as well, because uh, a research should actually start with a curiosity. It should start with a question. It should start with a mindset where we think about what are the nuances beyond what we are reading. So, for example, you read a text, I read a text, my interpretation of that text would be completely different than you. And that is the beauty of research, that is the beauty of literature. And I think so that is the way I think so our research means a lot in literary studies as well. So uh, since we are having this conversation now, we understand that how literary research is not about finding answers, but it is about learning to ask better questions, right? So, if I ask you a question like, when was Shakespeare born? Or where was Charles Dickens born? So, we all can Google it, right? We can Google it and find the answer. But what if I ask you, why do Dickens's orphans, like Charles Dickens's orphan protagonists, repeatedly become the central protagonist of the Victorian society? Can we Google this answer? The answer is no, because this requires not googling, but it requires a kind of interpretation. It requires textual evidence. It requires understanding of the historical period, the Victorian period, right? So when we talk about research, it is not about the illustration of the novels. It is about the evidences. It is about the various kind of dialogues that we are coming across. It is about the conversations that we have with our friends probably after reading a novel. Now, I'll give you a small example in this aspect. Recently, I was reading the novel The Vegetarian by Han Kang, right? So, one of my colleagues actually read this novel a year back. Now, obviously, we were not aware of this thing, and just it was just like we were having a small conversation about novels and our current readings, and I told her that. Now, that 5 minute conversation actually changed into a 50 minutes of discussion and brainstorming about how this particular novel, Vegetarian, symbolizes a lot of stuffs. Now, this is where research actually begins, with a small question, with a brainstorming thing. Now, let me give this with another example. Say, let us consider, for example, William Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? I maybe some of us have read Hamlet. Now, Hamlet is basically a revenge tragedy drama of William Shakespeare, right? So, this is the part of the story. Now, what happens is that we all, when we read this drama, probably there are a lot of questions that come across our mind, right? Like, what are the psychological aspects? What are the psychoanalytical analysis? How can we read Hamlet from Freudian aspect? Can we read it from the perspective of Michel Foucault? Can we include Jacques Derrida into it? Now, there are a lot of things. Now, just imagine so many multiple persuasive interpretations. Is so fascinating when we talk it in a literary perspective as well, right? So what makes actually literary research different is, first, the curiosity. Next is the evidence, the kind of evidences we gather, the kind of demonstrations we see through various kinds of learnings. For example, if Macbeth is ambitious, then we try to analyze and understand the metaphors of blood, darkness, the prophecies we see in Macbeth, the three witches, the kinship, the guilt driven, the madness of Lady Macbeth as well. So there are so many layers actually. It's like climbing the pillar. The third important aspect is the dialogue. Now, as I mentioned it just few minutes back, that when we talk about various novels, dramas, or poetry, we at times see that it's not actually monologuing. Now, what do you mean by a monologue? A monologue is basically when one person is talking. It's not a monologue. When we are doing a research, when we are reading something, it's a dialogue. It's a conversation with your mind also. Because if you are not talking to your own self, if you are not talking to your mind, if you are not asking yourself the questions, it's your research won't begin. That's the first step actually. Now, many a times we try to see that okay, there are a lot of research that has come from Shakespeare, there are a lot of research that we have seen in environmental studies, there are a lot of research we have seen in trauma as well. Now trauma though is a very new subject, but people are doing research on it. Now the question lies that where is our originality, our novelty, right? Now it's very simple. When you read a text, when you do literature review, when you read scholarly papers, you try to find the gap. Now, the gap hits you actually. So, when you read Hamlet from one perspective, you have to think it from a different angle. Say, how can, let's take an example, how can Hamlet be associated with Michel Foucault? Or say rather political structure. Now, probably this kind of research is very much underdeveloped. Now, there lies the catch actually, where you find the originality, the novelty in your research. So, like many of us have probably read and watched Harry Potter, right? So we have seen friendships, we have seen how there are lots of magic realism as well, right? In Harry Potter. Now the question arises: how can we see Harry Potter from a different angle? Let's think for a few seconds. Think Harry Potter from a different angle. What aspects does come to your mind? What are the things that come to your mind? I mean, anyone, if you wish to unmute yourself and answer this, I mean, you can please go ahead and do it. I mean, if Harry Potter is coming to your mind, can you think of something other than magic realism, other than friendship? Anything else? If anyone wants to answer.
Excuse me, madam. I just
Yes,
want to intervene once. We
yes,
will
yes.
take question and interactive session just after the deliberation. Otherwise,
Oh,
the
all
video
right.
quality will be gone.
Oh,
Okay.
all right, all right. That's perfect. That's perfect. Okay, no issues on this. Like I would tell this. Like I think so. Like we can see Harry Potter from a perspective of how boarding schools, because we see all the three important characters, Hermione, Harry Potter himself, that they are boarded into schools, and how the boarding schools actually construct institutional authority in Harry Potter. So when we talk about authoritarian power, we automatically talk about power and politics as well. So imagine how can a novel which talks about magic realism can also be actually talked of or been seen from a lens of political understanding, right? So this is how we can actually brainstorm ourselves, we can brainstorm our minds or even with our friends and start from one dialogue, right? So now moving ahead, like let us understand a small pathway from which we can understand how reading can lead into research, right? So it's not about reading, right? Because probably there's a particular term in reading called as skimming and scanning. So when we read these two elements, there are two different aspects that comes into our mind, right? For example, you are reading one novel, let's say Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, right? So when you are reading that novel, other than gender oppression, there are various elements about food like eggs, milk, bread. I mean, anybody who has read that novel would be able to relate to it, would be able to correlate, right? So now other than reading Handmaid's Tale as a completely, what should I say, gender oppressed feminist novel, we can understand it from food politics as well, from gastronomical perspective as well, right? You argue that, okay, other than gender oppression, what other factors are there in this particular novel? You see that, okay, food, right? Food is not developed. Let us talk about it. How can we build a thesis? Now, what is a thesis? A thesis is basically the argumentative structure, or rather your central argument of your research, right? So when you build that, you know what you're going to talk about. Now, what you have to do is that you have to start curating or finding out evidences from the novel, evidences from other novels which have talked about food as a particular genre. So, and then you start refining it, you start reading, questioning, revising the write up again and again. So now what happens is that I have often listened to this, that it becomes very difficult to change our thesis. No, because I think so that is research should not be restricted to the four walls, right? So when you're doing a research, if you're reading a novel, it is very important that you are open to multiple questions and multiple ideas. Say you are taking up one novel related to partition. Uh, Similarly, that novel can be connected to food studies as well. That novel can be connected to masculinity studies as well. In a similar context, I'll give you one more example to this. There's a particular novel, very famous novel of partition called Thomas, right? It's written by Bisham Sani. Mostly that novel is being researched upon from a very feminist perspective, from a very feminist lens. Now, when I read that novel, I thought it was my personal argument that why isn't masculinity being not delved upon? Why is masculinity so under researched in this particular novel? So, what I did is that I made a research paper on the masculinity and the crisis of masculinity based on Thomas. Now, that is where the fresh reading comes upon. That is where I think so your argument becomes much more balanced, and it becomes much more impactful as well. Now, moving ahead, as I told that reading is also noticing, right? So when we arrive at this particular juncture, it is not reading the theories, not about reading hundreds of novels, not about reading hundreds of textbooks or hundreds of theoretical texts or maybe hundreds of research papers. Now, here we have to be very tactful. So let me demonstrate this as well. Imagine you are reading The Great Gatsby, right? So obviously what we remember is Gatsby himself because he is the main protagonist, right? The parties, the romance. Now, move beyond that, right? What does Fitzgerald repeatedly describe colors? Don't you see there are so many colors being described, right? Green, gold, white. What does these colors represent? Does this kind of represent a moral universe? Now that observation automatically opens a dozen of research ideas, right? So when we talk about Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Type, we generally talk it from a very eco-critical perspective, from a perspective of Anthropocene, right? Like how basically the humanitarian aspects have changed the environmental study and everything. Now, when you read it from a different eye, always try to understand something. Any text, any novel has always been read and interpreted in the general thematic structure. Now, we have to understand the sub layers of those themes as well. Because when we talk about Hungry Tide, we see the climate vulnerability. We see how environmental displacement has caused. Now, suddenly, from this, we move to blue humanities. We move to Anthropocene studies. Now, blue humanities is a very, very, what should I say, a new kind of understanding, right? So, it is very important for us to understand that how, from a very small curiosity, a research question can actually develop. Now, see over here, like when we talk about Shakespeare, as I have used Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf as well in this particular slide, when we talk about Shakespeare, we always talk about the kind of language he has used, right? Because that language is not typically or addressed in our day-to-day life. We call it as quote unquote Shakespearean language. When we talk about his sonnets, there are very famous sonnets which actually talks about romantic love and all these things, right? So now the researcher won't say that I want to work on Shakespeare. If you want to work on Shakespeare, you have to actually conglomerate two or three theories along with it, because Shakespeare has already been studied. So if you have to study Shakespeare, because it's not that it has been studied, you cannot study about it anymore. That's a very wrong perspective. Because I think so, being researchers, being scholars, it is our responsibility to break that threshold and to actually peep into the domain of study where we can imagine that how we can rework on Shakespeare. Which text can be used? What is the problem? Which kind of theories we can use? What is the historical context? How can that historical context be actually morphed with today's political scenario or today's geopolitical atmosphere? Now, what happens is that most of the research questions actually do not come up with a very uh, uh, good hypothetical answer, right? So, what is love in Shakespeare, right? That is a very generic question we find, because there are lots of dissertations, there are lots of theses, there are lots of research papers that have already worked on the 38 plays of Shakespeare, that have worked on 150 sonnets of Shakespeare as well. So now the thing comes as that how does Shakespeare employ language of commerce to represent romantic novel? Now, what happens is that when we narrow this down, we identify a particular linguistic feature, that is language, right? We interpret it from the lens of economic discourses. Now, obviously, this is not a limitation. It is the foundation of what original content you are producing or what original content you are actually giving to your readers. Now, remember one thing, that scholars who are from literature, uh, we do field work, but our main research work, our main understanding is of reading, right? We have to read a lot. Now, when we read a lot, it is very important and significant for us to understand there are hundreds of scholars like us as well. So now, if I'm reading one novel, he or she or the other 99 people are also reading the same text. So we have to possibly find an original argument from there, so that our research is being published as well. So that there are scholars who are reading our text and getting, and actually there's a pathway opening for it as well. Now, when we talk about Virginia Woolf, or let us say we talk about Eliot, Wordsworth has talked of nature, right? Dickens has talked of women. Now, these are already being developed, already being researched. So, if I say that how are women represented in Dickens, automatically your research paper would be rejected, because that question has already been answered. That question has already been, what should I say, has already been developed. Now you have to think that how does actually Dickens use domestic labor? Now, see how we are narrowing down the question from women representation to domestic labor to construct a middle class femininity. Now, understand how the difference is subtle, yet it is very profound, right? When we talk about the second question, that is, how does Dickens use domestic labor to construct middle class femininity in Bleak House or say any particular novel, we automatically talk about lot of things. We talk about labor studies, we talk about gender theory, we talk about the Victorian social history. So can you imagine the and there is no such thing that in one research paper we have to use one theory. That's a kind of what should I say? That's a kind of that's a kind of a like thing which we believe upon, but it's not true, right? It's never true, that because you have to understand that when we take up novels, it is not possible to take each new novel when you are doing a research, because it's not possible. It's technically not ever possible. But the thing lies in how you include theories and connect the dots actually. Now, when we talk about Great Gatsby, what we were discussing a few minutes back, we automatically think about materialism. how different colors are being used. As I told you, we can infuse and induce color studies as well. So for example, recently Frankenstein came into Netflix, right? Now we all know that Frankenstein basically talks about scientific responsibility. It talks about science. It talks about how a monster is being created, right? So why do we have to talk about the monster? We can talk about how does a creature challenge humanity. We can talk about how Mary Shelley anticipate post-human theories, because when we are talking about Frankenstein, he is a post-human creature, right? So we can use post-humanism to understand Shelley's works as well, right? So in this way, what happens is a topic describes a field and the questions create the scholarship as such, right? Now, this is something which I have just created. This is a finer test for a strong research question. Now, once we have a potential question, we understand that how do we know whether it is worth it or not, right? We can use a tool for that. What is that tool? It is a very humanized kind of a tool, not some AI tool or something. It is a way you can understand if you're on the right track or not, right? F stands for focused. Now, a focused question will identify from a particular text, a particular issue, from a period, or from a particular concept as well. Now, say we are talking about women in Indian literature. Sarojini Naidu will come into your mind. Mahashweta Devi will come into your mind, because these are women who are brilliant actually, right? Now, let us remember. For example, we are talking about maternal silence as a political resistance in Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi, right? Now, understand how the entire question about women in Indian literature became more focused to Mahasweta Devi's particular novel, and that too about silence, about the maternal silence. This is how you can be focused. Understand that there's an umbrella thing, and you have to just narrow it down. You have to understand it from a different lens. The question is same. It is about women's studies only, but from a different angle, from a different perspective, from a different vision. Now, the second step is interesting. Now, this will sound a little bit subjective, but it is a very critical step as well. So, if you are not intrigued by a question, you will obviously not be able to understand what your project or what your research is about, right? So, research often involves reading the same thing a number of times rather than reading a lot. It is like reading the same thing lot of times. So you have to ask yourself that would I still enjoy reading this 6 months later or not? So remember, it has to be interesting to you. Then only you can make your writing interesting. Then only you can make the research interesting, and you can make the research question interesting as well. So if the answer is no, then you have to rethink about it. You have to rethink about your primary resources, right? The next step is the novelty. Now, we have been discussing this, but still, novelty does not come from the novel. Novelty does not arise from what you are reading. It arises by combining various theories. Because I just mentioned a few minutes back, probably, that the theories that we have, if we combine it, when we look into it, we find that if you are using three particular theories for one research paper, it is a triangle kind of a structure that is being formed. It's automatically something which is being less used. It is somewhat where your methodologies are emerging. Like you are using blue humanities and you are using animal studies. Can you imagine the kind of research that can come through it? So it is very important that how with familiar text you are asking unfamiliar questions. It might sound absurd, but this is how your approach should be. Like if you're studying Shakespeare, there are 4 centuries that have actually studied. Okay, right? So now it is very important how you approach Shakespeare actually through digital humanities, through disability studies, through animal studies, through environmental humanities. Now this is where the novelty lies in the perspective. Think of a novel, think of all the ideas, all the themes that has been discussed. Now try to understand it from a very unfamiliar way. Because when you read theories, you understand what the theories are all about. You know what is environmental studies about, what is eco-criticism about, what is eco-poetics about, right? Now it comes to us, how do we connect it? And there is no such thing that it cannot be connected. Everything can be connected if you have evidences on it. If you have evidences. Now with this we come to the next part actually, that is evidences. Now the thing is that if it can be answered, if you can provide evidences, if you can provide quotations, if you can provide primary resources based on that particular understanding or research, automatically that becomes a study. So research is not difficult. It can never be difficult because it is our own curiosity that arises the question. And I think so with these steps, the finer steps of this particular thing that I have jotted for you all, I think so it will be much more helpful for everyone present here or everyone who will be watching to understand how research should be approached, especially when we are coming from English literature background, right? And the last thing that I would be talking about in this particular slide is relevance. Now, as I told you that when we talk about partition studies, we are talking about trauma, we are talking about memory. Can we talk about displacement? Can we talk about geopolitical studies? Can we talk about border studies? Can we talk about climate migration? Can we talk about animal studies? Yes, we can talk about animal studies as well when we talk about partition. When we read a partition novel, like I'm taking an example of a partition novel. Let's take up a novel of any, like the train to last train by Kushwant Singh, right? Let us take up that novel. Or say, for example, let us talk about the very contemporary novel that is Gitanjali Shree's The Tomb of Sand, right? Now understand that it has been talked about from an octogenarian perspective, right? Now, can we talk about climate from that novel? Or else take another novel. Can we talk about animals, like the displacement of the animals? How a particular novel related to partition can be talked from animal studies? So good research actually does not talk about the text. It talks about how I can answer it. Has anybody answered it? If anybody has answered it, can I answer it in a different way? How do I care about this research? What are the evidences we have? So the final test, that is focused, interesting, novel, evidences, and relevant, these are the steps that can make our research much more interesting and intriguing, and it can help us to make our research much more crucial and important as well. Now, moving forward, the literature review section, right? So many students or many scholars, even I myself, I used to misunderstand literature review, right? Now we think that it is a summary of everything. No, it is not a summary, okay? Now, when we talk about literature review, it is actually an intellectual understanding of how various kind of conversations have been done related to a particular work, right? So the first step is you have to locate. Now, how do you locate? There are a lot of databases. You can use Shodh Ganga that is the repository of thesis. You can use LibGuide. You can use you can use academia.edu. You can use Google Scholar. There are a lot of places where you can actually locate your work. Okay. Now, once you locate your work, the first thing that you have to understand and do is that you have to sort it, right? If you know that, yes, these are the particular texts I'm working upon, just make sure that you filter it down. Or if you know that these are the theories I'm working upon, filter it in a way that only those theoretical works are coming into your mind, right? So when, like, literature review is basically like you are walking into a room where there are 20 scholars discussing, say, a novel Beloved by Toni Morrison, right? One is arguing about memory, the other one is talking about motherhood, one is talking about trauma, someone is talking about slavery. So now there are so many aspects. Just imagine one novel talking about so many perspectives. It's like moving into a room where it's a potpourri of ideas. Now, your literature review should introduce those voices. It should identify the argument, and it should agree and disagree both. Now, this is the task. Often we find that in literature review, it is just the summary. No, we do not summarize in literature review. when we do literature review, it is always either agreeing or disagreeing to those critical conversations. It is always trying to explain our perspective, our understanding of that particular work. So, in other words, when we talk about literature review, it will answer three vital questions. What do we already know? Where are the scholars disagreeing? And what is unexplored even now? Now, these three questions will determine the kind of work you are going to make up. Now, we were discussing about hungry tide. Now, hungry tide can be looked from three very important perspectives. That is environmental criticism, post-colonial identity, and say, for example, cultural studies as well. Now, see, language and translation is a very underdeveloped work. Blue humanities is a very underdeveloped work. How we are talking about the deltaic structure, how we are talking of the Sundarban and the Bonjibi tribe and everything over there. Now, this makes your contribution, or this makes your scholarly work a contribution actually to the field, right? So now it is very important to understand that how do I find this gap. It is why you evaluate. As I told you, you have to locate the evidences, you have to argue with yourself, and you have to see what scholars have explored and what has to be considered. So this is how you basically do the literature review, or you survey, right? Now, moving forward, uh, now let us understand that what are the particular databases where we can get lot of archives actually, right? So where do you find scholars actually doing research? Because I think so Google is something which gives you a lot of idea, but it is not a scholarly database, right? So when I started with my research, I would share this thing. I used to Google when I started my research 5 years from now, like 5 years back from now. I used to Google. Then I learned it. I self-learned myself that what are the areas. I watched videos. I taught myself that what are the areas where, what are the databases, because there are numerous databases other than these as well. For example, when we talk about JSTONE, it's excellent for historical scholarship, humanities journals as well. Even if you choose one journal, there are a lot of, like you can access those journals from your universities as well. And you can actually download papers that coincide with your research ideas. Now, MLA International Bibliography is another important index for literature studies as well. Project Muse is very ideal for contemporary criticism and university press publications as well. Google Scholar, as I mentioned, is very useful because you can search actually. You can search one particular scholar and you can see the kind of work they have done. So you basically can track down the kind of ideas that are generating or liberating at this point of time. And Scopus and Web of Science, these are like huge databases where you can actually identify high impact journals, how the citation works, very important scholars you can connect with, because I think so interacting and moving ahead with scholars and learning from their works is very, very significant. Now, if you talk about a topic like how food metaphors are used in Toni Morrison, right? Like, how will you combine this? You will be combining as Toni Morrison and food studies, like Toni Morrison plus food studies, right? You will be using another search term or in the engine as literary gastronomy. So try to understand that there are specific words as well. There are specific linguistic terms as well that has to be used when you're talking or researching or trying to find out on one particular topic. For example, you talk about consumption and identity. Now, in this way, what happens is you will find the kind of research work that has already been done. So I will always encourage everyone reading, learning, and watching this to actually think like detectives. Okay, I mean, like you see one particular research work, you see one particular paper or a manuscript, go to the work cited, go to the reference list, because one citation actually leads to another citation. This has actually helped myself, honestly speaking, because most of the time I have seen that I have built my own archive, my own literature review from various citations that I have seen. not from things that I have downloaded from probably Gestor or Project News or from other databases. I've seen that when I download a PDF, where if it is open access or accessible to all, I always go to the cited list, because when I move to the cited list, I always see that there are numerous citations being there. Now, what I try to do is that I go to those citations further. Now, understand, one research paper probably carrying 20 citations. So you automatically have a database of now 20 research papers, right? Or 20 probably primary resources or 20 secondary resources. Now, if you move to those every 20 resources, probably out of those, 10 are another research papers. Now, understand how the chain is being formed. Now, 10 research papers will open to another 10 research papers. So, this is how you actually build yourself on the sources that you get. Right now, moving ahead, uh, now always try to understand that when we know how to formulate a research question, and how does the survey actually happens, right? How do we determine basically which sources are trustworthy, right? So first thing you have to understand, that is it peer reviewed or not, right? Because that's the academic credibility that we have. Go to the kind of when if you move to one particular journal, please make sure that you are going to the indexing and abstracting portion. When you go there, you will be able to see that the kind of credibility or the kind of weightage that particular journal is holding, right? Now, when you move to various kinds of authors, for example, try to understand if that author is a recognized scholar or not. What kind of work they have done? How have they engaged with different texts, right? Like, for example, we know that how Edward Said is oriented with Orientalism, how Judith Butler talks about gender performativity, right? So now we have to see that how scholars have used these people, or rather these scholars, in order to make their work much more significant and crucial as well. So as you read each source, it becomes very important for you to write down and record the central argument, the kind of theoretical work that you are building, the kind of textual evidences you are getting. If you are reading, whatever strikes you, just mark it, just label it for yourself, right? If you're using a PDF note, there's always a PDF marker which you can edit. So edit it. Try to understand where your argument is going to be built upon. Try to find the possible gaps or probably the unanswered questions as well. Now, this is what makes your habit from reading into active scholarship, right? Now, moving ahead, in this particular slide, we are going to talk about uh, how we arrive at one of the most exciting aspects of literary research, right? Now, many students approach theory as like, as you can see, I have actually conglomerated few of the theories in this particular slide, talking about formalism, Marxist criticism, feminism, and etc. Now, when we talk about, for example, we are talking about formalism or new criticism, right? Now, if we take a text that is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because we just talked about it as well. Now, Victor creates the creature who is named Frankenstein, right? Now, we have to understand that if we are talking it from the formalism perspective or new criticism perspective, how can we focus on language and imagery? Like, how does Shelley use light or probably darkness in order to shape the novel's moral ambiguity as well? Now, if we talk about Marxist criticism, we see how kind of labor or class ideologies are being formed as well. So imagine one text can be actually talked from all this perspective. Even if we talk about eco-criticism, we can see that how nature and human conflicts are being shown. So now understand, the novel has not changed. The questions have emerged. The theory does not impose anything. It is just that how you are illuminating your directions, basically. How you can use one novel particularly to talk about different aspects, to talk about different theories as well. Now, when we talk about Amitav Ghosh, because he majorly talks about eco-criticism and environmental studies, there is one other novel of his very famous Gun Island. Now, we might be talking about how does climate change or probably migration, digital technologies, and all these things are reshaping human identity. But understand that how this novel can actually be talked about energy humanities, right? Can you imagine? Gun Island being associated with energy humanities, with digital humanities. Now, this is where your novelty or your key understanding arises. The novel is not changing, it is simply how you are choosing the correct theories in order to make your reading more fashionable, in order to make your readers, flabbergasted that, wow, this is something really intriguing, this is something really unique. Now, moving ahead to close reading. Now, this is a very foundational method, or rather, the foundational approach of how we should be connecting the dots, right? How you should observe, how you should basically question, connect, and situate. Now, these four steps might look very easy, might look okay. This could be done in a blink side. No, this is the foundation. So if you do not have a good foundation, your building won't stand an earthquake, right? So in a similar way, if your foundation of reading is not correct or not proper in your research paper won't stand strong. Why should an editor publish your research paper and not somebody else's? Now, there the question rises. Now, when we talk about Macbeth, there is a very famous line called as out, out, brief candle. Now, this appears like a metaphor, right? Now, metaphor is a literary device which actually compares two dissimilar things, right? Now, the candle here can symbolize fragility. It can talk about how power gets changes. It can talk about the futility of ambition. It can talk about death as well. Now, simply understand a small phrase of four words can actually determine or change whole scholarly understanding of a work, or can interpret different network of meanings. So suppose when we read anything, understand how the images are occurring. How do you identify patterns? So it's basically identifying patterns, the metaphors, the syntax, the rhythm, the language being used, and please ask yourself, is there anything that is repeating itself? Is there anything that is being patterned? Because every author has a pattern of writing. Somebody uses very somebody uses colors, one of our sense organs, to visualize. Somebody might use a lot of smell, like your olfactory is being charged up. So observe. So when you observe, basically you try to understand the pattern as well. Now when you understand the pattern, you have to relate it to larger themes as well, right? And then you have to situate it with some theoretical or historical context as well. So in this way, you can determine that you do not quote something which has already been quoted, but you quote it in a way which becomes much more interesting and much more important for the readers to understand it as well. Now, when we build a thesis, as I previously mentioned as well, building a thesis is basically building your argument, right? Everything we have discussed actually comes to a particular core idea now. Now, research, we know that is a completely different kind of approach to academics. We observe, we try to argue, we try to, place ourselves into that particular domain. We try to place ourselves in between that text. We observe, we describe, and then we debate, and then we support and challenge as well. That is scholarship. Now, when we develop a similar kind of a literary argument, research questions, thesis, supporting claims, and textual evidences are the four important factors that actually makes ourselves much more interesting, and it makes our relationship with our research much more authentic and novel as well. Now we have taken Handmaid's Tale. So I'll go back to that particular novel because I told how food like milk, bread are being repeated continuously. Because probably we have less talked about food in Handmaid's Tale. We have more or less talked about how women are being controlled. Now understand how you can develop an argument from this point. You can say that Margaret Atwood transforms food into a technology of reproductive control, which links nourishment to political domination. Now, this automatically connects the dots, and it makes ourselves understand that how this observation has also connected into an argument as well. So, what happens is a reading, an argument mixed with theory, brings uh, unseen meanings into possible visible light. So, till now, we have actually discussed about various ideas that can begin from a reading into scholarly writing. Now, over here, we are discussing about how thesis can be built, how your journey from dissertation to publication can emerge, what kind of literary scholarships can actually make yourself much more scholarly rather than from a casual reader you can become a successful researcher as well, right? So now since we have learned about how to identify the problem, how to formulate a question, how to read very critically, what kind of theories we can use, now it is very important for us to move into citations and academic integrity as well. Now, we all know that maintaining academic integrity is critical or crucial because uh, you wouldn't want your own work to be published by some other person, right? That's what is integrity about. So, if you are, say, for example, you read somebody's work and you are not giving that particular author that space of thankfulness that, okay, you have read him or her, and then you do not cite that person, that's plagiarism. Because it is not, it is about honesty, it is about the respect that you give to your co-scholar. Because when you participate in a scholarly community, when you become a part of a scholarly community, it is important to cite, even if you are taking a small word from any particular text or any particular different scholar, it is important to cite it. So yes, citation is very important. Now, there are four types of plagiarism basically. Now, one is direct, where you just take up somebody's own words and you just write it down. You do not give that person the credit that he or she deserves. Now, the next one is patch writing. It's basically like you are morphing the words, you are changing the words, and you are basically changing the structure and you are writing it. So, this is very important for us that we do not do it. Next is basically how you self plagiarize as well. Now, how do you do that? Basically, you have published a research paper and you have done it in your own name, and the second research paper takes some ideas from that initial or the first research paper. Now, it's very important that you mention your name as well over there, because if you don't, then you are self plagiarizing yourself. Another important thing is that these days the question automatically comes that, is AI using incorrect? No. If you are using ChatGPT, if you are using any sort of artificial intelligence tools to improve your grammar, to improve your reading, to summarize articles, I can always tell my students or my fellow scholars that that accelerates your work, basically. That is not wrong. That does not determine your integrity. Because if you're using a tool, say for example, previously, we used to write down everything in notepad or probably in our notebooks. After that, it came, there's a digital version of it, right? So that, does that mean that we are not sincere towards our work? No. It just means that you are using digital tools, you are using AI tools to make your work smoother, to make your to make your research much more accelerated, right? So if you are using AI tools, I do not think that the original idea of your own is being snatched away, because it is your own idea, it is your own question. You are just improvising probably the language, probably the grammar, or probably you are using because when we use citations as well, there are a lot of MLA tools. There's a particular tool called as Scribber. We use it to generate citations, and there is no harm in it, because I think so it is very important to use tools in order to make your work better and smoother as well, in terms of presentation, in terms of formatting and everything. Now, now there's a very important thing that I'm being asked, that how is probably a MA research different from a PhD research, right? Or from an undergraduate research. Now, when we talk about postgraduate level or undergraduate level, we try to understand something from a very broad idea. Like, you probably ask your supervisor, what is the intervention? How do we approach it? Now, when we come to doctoral research, this approach actually changes. Now, we do not ask our supervisor, we ask ourselves that what knowledge will actually exist, because your thesis did not exist before. It is something that you are contributing to this universe, to this world, to your society, to your community. So, a doctoral research is an original contribution towards the society, to a larger space, actually, to a larger environment. So, uh, you do not compare MA dissertation with somebody else's PhD thesis, because both of them completely answer differently. Both of them have different structures. A MA dissertation is much crisp compared to a thesis, compared to a thesis chapter, right? Your approach, because when you do postgraduate dissertation, that's the first step towards research. You will learn a lot of things, and slowly your research matures after that, and after that you become much more mature as well. Now, this is probably the most favorite part of mine to in this session, actually, because many people tend to believe that literary studies is declining, but I completely disagree to it, because I think so literature has become more interdisciplinary and more multidisciplinary. The traditional approaches have somehow moved into a lot of different algorithms, right? We are using social media, we are using climate, even a small reel. Like, for example, if you are scrolling reels one fine evening, a research idea can pop up from there as well. So this is how I think so our literary research has modified, because there are a lot of emerging research areas that are coming into limelight. For example, digital humanities. How can machines identify different kinds of stylistic structures? Um, there are platform studies as well. We can use Netflix, Amazon Prime, then Instagram poetry, and how these actually form discourse studies as well. How does this engage with reader? Now, reader response theory comes into limelight through this. So this has come into limelight. The how can like, for example, you can even use AI and literature as well as a form of your new idea of research. Now, how can you do that? For example, some AI generated writing and a literary work, human generated writing. How do you compare both of them? Like, how does it emerge from artificial consciousness, right? So what is the literary creativity in it? Most trending research ideas have also originated from environmental humanities, right? Right now we have forest literature, we have blue humanities, we have animal ethics, we have energy humanities, waste studies, we have waste politics as well. Now these kinds of research did not exist 20 years back, or probably did not even exist 10 years back. So when I talk about literature, when I talk about literary studies, we see how the scholarship has actually emerged and evolved as well, because medical humanities, medical research, these are the things that are coming into limelight a lot. So with this, actually, I shall be giving a very small, or a small final closing of this particular session, because I think so I have taken a lot of time so far, but still I'll just wrap up into 2 or 3 minutes by saying that if you want to do research, first of all, you have to be very curious. You have to be curious about everything. Everything can be questioned, because if you question, you are already taking the first step. Now, it is very important that you read, you write, and if there's criticism, you take it as well. So, uh, so just imagine that if there are two students reading the same novel, one will finish the book and keep it in the bookshelf. The other one will probably think that why is this ending this way and not the other way? Why was this character written in this way? If I write this character, I will probably write it in a different way. So as I conclude today's session, I hope you carry one simple idea with yourself, that you do not read literature merely to discover, but you read it to discover what it has to say even now. So, because every work of literature, everything that you read, everything that you come across has a kind of question, has a kind of idea which could be determined, which could be questioned by our generation. So, thank you so much, everyone, for your time, for your attention, and for your participation. I am eternally grateful to Modak Trainer Academy for giving me this opportunity. And I would now welcome questions or any sort of comments and reflections that I think so could be done.